In the wake of the US government's declaration of a war on terror in 2001 came the questions and the theories. What happened on the 11th of September 2001 as terrorists crash-hijacked airliners into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? Did the US government actually carry out the attack to provide it with an excuse for an invasion of Iraq? Or was the Air Force's lack of reaction on that day simply due to poor intelligence and communication? Conspiracy theorists point to the unwillingness of the United States government to hold a full inquiry into the events of September the 11th, 2001. Dick Cheney initially opposed an investigation into the terrorist attacks. His reason was that resources and personnel would be taken away from the war on terrorism. It was over a year before the official investigation finally began. By contrast, the investigations into the attack on Pearl Harbor and the assassination of President Kennedy began after only 9 and 7 days respectively. When the 9/11 investigations finally got underway, a number of inconsistent explanations were offered in response to questions relating to matters such as the failing of the military to prevent the attacks. Perhaps the key to the prevalence of conspiracy theories is not so much the physical evidence as the belief that because of an ulterior motive, the government condoned or even positively encouraged the terrible attack. In the most popular of those theories, which was given a boost by the Michael Moore film Fahrenheit 9/11, it is reasoned that the United States government, dominated by powerful neoconservatives and the oil business, welcomed the disaster in order to rally public support for a war in the Middle East. Although such a war would purport to be a war on terror, it would really be a war for oil. It would also have the effect of increasing defense spending, which would be good for the government-linked defense industry. Finally, it would also allow the passage of repressive new legislation, such as the USA Patriot Act, which granted extra powers to the federal government. See, from this point of view, the events of September the 11th were basically a modern-day restaging of the attack on Pearl Harbor or the sinking of the Lusitania, during which catastrophes, at least if you believe the conspiracy version, a government stood by and watched its own people massacred in order that it could drum up support for an unpopular war. This is a scenario that persuaded many, particularly in the wake of the widely unpopular war in Iraq. But was it really credible? Did any of it really add up to prove that the United States government stood by and watched its citizens die? Not according to Popular Mechanics magazine. This publication assembled a panel of experts and went through the theories relating to the destruction of the WTC Twin Towers. The findings of its experts suggested that some aspects of the collapse of the towers were unusual but not impossible. And, after all, how many times in the past have similar events taken place? Thereby providing a comparison. In addition, the remainder of the evidence, the alleged cancellation of flights by Pentagon officials on the day of the attacks, for instance, was just as likely to be made up of a series of simple coincidences as anything more sinister. Also, the president's odd behaviour on hearing the news may simply have been a kind of panic paralysis. Overall, the suggestion that the government actively allowed the 9/11 attacks to take place is extremely far-fetched. The charge of incompetence is rather more likely to stick, Of course, although the fact that anonymous accounts of intelligence reach the United States government every day should be borne in mind. On the other hand, it is hard to dismiss the allegations that the United States government and the oil and defense industries have done very well out of the war on terror that followed the events of September the 11th. This was one cloud whose lining had rather a lot of silver in it, especially if you were a Halliburton shareholder. As a result, the United States government may have been open to accusations that it has used the 9/11 tragedy to help its friends make profits. But that is quite a different thing from suborning mass murder. The conspiracy theorists may ultimately have a point, but to claim that the United States government masterminded the attacks is, in most people's view, stretching credibility more than a little far. The events of September the 11th have produced what must be the most widely viewed news footage ever shot. On the face of it, you might think that there is no mystery at all about the events that have been so famously recorded. Arab terrorists hijacked 4 aircraft before flying 2 of them into the World Trade Center, another into the Pentagon, and the 4th into the Pennsylvania field. Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility. Given that Al-Qaeda is not only a terrorist organization with a deep hatred of the United States, but is also responsible for a previous attack on the World Trade Center, that is the end of the story, surely. Well, not as far as the conspiracy theorists are concerned. They maintain that what we saw was a staged political stunt. And who was responsible? Why, the United States government, of course. Depending on which version of the theory you subscribe to, the government either allowed a real Al-Qaeda attack to take place without preventing it, or they carried out the whole operation themselves. So, what possible evidence could there be for such an apparently outrageous supposition? Much of the more responsible conspiracy speculation focuses upon the lead-up to the attacks. As described, the United States government was supplied with a considerable amount of intelligence that suggested that Al-Qaeda was planning an attack. While most of us might be inclined to put the government's lack of reaction down to incompetence, the more cynically minded see it as part of a deliberate pattern. Let us begin by looking at the key events in detail, starting with the incident in which the 2 aircraft crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center. To most observers, what happened seems simple enough. Planes hit towers and explode. Towers fall down. But it wasn't long before this version of the events became the subject of apparently well-informed speculation. The debate focused on whether or not the impact of the aircraft, coupled with the subsequent fire, would really be enough to bring down such huge structures. What really brought down the Twin Towers? According to some experts, buildings 1, 2 and 7 of the World Trade Center are the only steel frame structures in history to have collapsed because of fire. Particularly controversial because it had not been hit by an aircraft at all is the fate of building number 7, which collapsed some hours after the 2 main towers. Furthermore, according to one demolition expert, the huge clouds of concrete dust that were seen billowing out of the towers were symptomatic of an explosion rather than a fire. Other alleged experts claim that the way in which the towers fell straight down had every appearance of controlled demolition. Finally, the wreckage from the towers appeared to contain molten steel. Fire would not cause steel to become molten, but a bomb would. The conspiracy theorists are clear about what these alleged facts add up to. They claim that the towers of the World Trade Center must have been rigged with explosives in order to make sure that the disaster was as traumatic as possible. Then there is the Pentagon. The plane that crashed into the Pentagon was able to fly towards the building for 40 minutes without being intercepted. Despite the existence of sophisticated radar technology and anti-missile batteries, not to mention the building's proximity to Andrews Air Force Base. When the aircraft finally hit the building, it collided with the West Wing, which was nearly empty at the time because of construction work. Once again, government complicity is a clear implication of this event to the conspiracy theorists. Perhaps the most famous piece in this particular conspiracy jigsaw is the notorious footage of President Bush reading a story to children in a kindergarten at the time that the aide announced that the first plane had struck the World Trade Center. Instead of leaping into action, the president simply carried on reading the story. In Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 9/11, the footage was used to imply that Bush knew exactly what was going on. Further suspicious behaviour, in the eyes of the conspiracy theorists, came in the days following the attack. The government had neither produced the voice recorders nor the flight data recorders, or the black boxes, from the aircraft that were involved in the New York attack. That had never happened in any previous major domestic crash. They have also failed to comment on whether or not the black boxes were recovered from the wreckage. There are also anomalies relating to the identity of the hijackers. Given the general level of carnage, much doubt has been cast on the discovery, near the Twin Towers, of an undamaged passport belonging to one of the hijackers. The identities of the 19 hijackers are still much disputed. Walid al-Shahiri, one of the men named as being a hijacker by the FBI on the 9/11 attacks webpage, later turned up alive and protested his innocence. The identities of 3 other hijackers were also in doubt. The story of Flight 93, the fourth of the planes to be hijacked on September the 11th, has become a modern legend. The passengers on Flight 93 were in a different situation to those in the other aircraft, who cannot have known that the hijackers were planning to turn the planes into flying bombs. On Flight 93, however, thanks to the mobile phone, passengers were soon made all too aware of what was planned for them. Their plane was in the Washington region, so it was more than likely that they were heading for the White House. If they just sat there and did nothing, they were certain to die. Gradually, as we know from the final anguished phone calls to loved ones, the passengers decided to fight back. One of them, Todd Beamer, uttered the immortal words, "Let's roll." And then there was silence. No more phone calls. The next thing anyone knows for certain is that Flight 93, a Boeing 757, crashed in rural Pennsylvania, near the town of Shanksville. The accepted story is that the passengers rose up and wrested control from the hijackers, and that in the course of the struggle the plane went out of control and plunged into the ground. The passengers had sacrificed their lives in order that many more would be saved. They had been given the status of American heroes. Today, there are not many who would dispute that the passengers were indeed heroes. However, there are plenty who wonder just exactly what caused the plane to plummet to the earth in such a way, and who question the received version of events. Essentially, the crash of Flight 93 is the subject of 2 alternative theories. The first of these maintains that there was an explosion on board the plane. This notion is given substance by the fact that, in his final phone call, a passenger said that one of the hijackers claimed to be carrying a bomb. The remaining option is that the aircraft was shot down on the orders of the United States government before it could hit its target. This is the theory that has aroused much controversy, with the suggestion that the government could have authorized the death of its own people. So, what evidence is there to suggest that such a thing might have happened? Well, first, there is the timescale. By the time Flight 93 crashed, everyone knew what had happened to the World Trade Center Twin Towers and the Pentagon. A frantic search of United States airspace was taking place in order to establish whether or not any other planes had been hijacked. United States government acknowledges that the first fighters with the mission to intercept took off at 8:52 a.m. and another set of fighters took off from Andrews Air Force Base near Washington at 9:35 a.m., precisely the time that Flight 93 turned through almost 180 degrees and started heading straight for Washington. At that time, the F-16s were no more than 10 minutes flying time away, yet it was to be another 30 minutes before Flight 93 crashed. Surely, one would have expected one of the F-16s to have reached the plane well before 10:06 a.m. To back up this line of thinking, there is evidence from a federal flight controller, published a few days later in New Hampshire. He said that an F-16 had been in hot pursuit of the hijacked United jet and must have seen the whole thing. Also, immediately before the crash took place, CBS television briefly reported that 2 F-16 fighters were tailing Flight 93. All fairly suspicious, but the question remains, would the United States government shoot its own plane down like that? On the 16th of September, Vice President Dick Cheney announced that President Bush had authorized the Air Force pilots to shoot down hijacked commercial aircraft. This statement strongly supports the allegations that the F-16s that took off from Washington had been ordered to protect the White House at all costs. One might expect the crash scene would offer a clear indication as to whether the aircraft was hit by a missile in the air or had simply hit the ground. This is where the controversy really starts to rage. Conspiracy theorists are convinced that the forensic evidence points to the plane having been brought down by a mid-air impact. The key evidence they cite is the wide dispersal of the aircraft's debris. Letters and other light refuse from the plane were discovered 8 miles from the scene of the crash. The aircraft had disintegrated into pieces no more than 2 inches long, and a section of one of the engines, which in itself weighed a ton, was found 600 yards from the site of the crash. Other remains of the plane were found 2 miles away, near a town called Indian Lake. Furthermore, the debris was not scattered evenly along the route between the different sites, but was grouped into distinct clusters. This, the conspiracy theorists argue, is clear evidence that debris was blown out of the plane by an initial mid-air explosion. The FBI, for its part, waved their suspicions away. The paper debris that was found 8 miles away, they said, was blown there by the wind, while the engine section flew 600 yards due to the force of the aircraft's impact with the ground. They concluded that nothing was found that was inconsistent with the plane going into the ground intact. And if all this was not enough, there is one final mystery that the conspiracy theorists point to: the mystery of the white plane. Several eyewitnesses reported seeing a white plane flying very low just before Flight 93 crashed. At first, the FBI denied that there had been any such plane in the neighbourhood. Then, as eyewitnesses continued to insist that they had seen such an aircraft, they announced that there had been a plane after all, a civilian business jet. Because it had been flying within 20 miles of Flight 93, the authorities had requested the pilot to descend from 37,000 feet to 5,000 feet in order to survey the crash site and transmit the map coordinates for responding emergency crews. If anything, this explanation made the conspiracy theorists all the more suspicious. Firstly, by this time, all non-military aircraft within the United States airspace had received clear orders to land at the nearest airport. Secondly, at a time of such uncertainty and with F-16s supposedly in the vicinity, it seems utterly implausible that the military would seek assistance from the pilot of a civilian aircraft that just happened to be in the area. So, do the conspiracy theorists have a case? The evidence that F-16s did catch up with Flight 93 is certainly troubling, as is the pattern of the debris from the crash, and it is hard to believe that the government would have simply allowed the plane to come any closer to Washington. On the other hand, none of the witnesses to the aircraft's actual crash reported it as having been consumed by a fireball. If it was hit by a missile, it certainly did not explode on impact. Perhaps consideration should be given to the less discussed possibilities that one of the terrorists on board may have been carrying a bomb. It certainly ties all the elements of the story together. The heroic passengers took on the hijackers. Then one of the hijackers accidentally or deliberately detonates the bomb, and the aircraft plunges to the ground before pursuing. F-16s are forced to confront the option of killing a plane load of their fellow citizens. Whatever the full truth of the matter, what remains undeniable is the courage of the passengers who were caught up in a terrible situation.